We're living in a time when people are choosing to have fewer children. I want to know what that means, not just statistically, but personally. I hadn't given a thought to falling birth rates until my MuniSquare colleague Matt Candland brought it up one afternoon. Matt was perplexed by the worldwide phenomenon and wondered what this portends for our future. He saw it not just as a statistic, but as a question about meaning. What does it say about how we are living and how our future will look? That question stayed with me and led to this conversation with Matt and historian Gary Cross, author of Men to Boys, The Making of Modern Immaturity. He has studied how independence became its own identity. I've been skeptical of studies that claim most women just don't want kids. I want to know more, like why. It's a conversation that looks backward and forward at the habits we've inherited and the choices we're making now. I hope you will come away with your own insights and questions about what this means for our time and for our future. Thank you for being here. We hope you enjoy the conversation. If you're not a subscriber to MuniSquare, please consider becoming one. Matt starts us off today with some historical context and a startling turnaround in population.
Sure. Just to set the stage, a little bit of background information. So what we're talking about is a decline in birth rates. Gary and I are both old enough to remember the population bomb, which predicted that population was going to increase indefinitely and was going to create all sorts of problems. And what we've been seeing really over the last 20 years, and it's increasing as time goes by, we're seeing a decline, which I don't think anyone saw coming. Nicholas Eberstadt, who's a Stanford University professor, he has this great quote. He says, quote, "Humans are about to enter a new era of history. For the first time since the Black Death in the 1300s, the planetary population will decline," which is fascinating. I mean, it kind of puts it in perspective that this is something really unprecedented in recent history. And again, just to remind people, in order to have stable population, every woman on average has to have 2.1 kids. Anything less than that will reduce the population. According to the Centers for Disease Control in the U.S. right now, we're at 1.59. So we are currently below the stable population. And every continent in the world, with the exception of Africa, is also below replacement numbers. So my point is, from what I've been able to gather, there appear to be a lot of factors to this. But it seems to me one of the primary ones is that women just don't want to have children. That's one of the angles I'd like to explore a little bit. Why do women not want to have children?
Excellent. Gary, what would you like to bring forward today?
Well, I'm a historian, so I'm looking at long-term trends, and it strikes me it's important to understand why the birth rate seems to be dropping so rapidly. But it's also important to understand that this is actually a very long trend. It's just briefly interrupted in the 50s and 1960s. In 1800, American women produced almost 8 children. By 1930, it was 2 children. So it was an enormous drop, and that's happened long, long ago. And what we're facing now is perhaps too far in the direction of small birth rates. But the long-term trend toward reduced birth rates is pretty universal and inevitable. It really is part of a very simple cycle. Back in the 17th, 18th century and all the way back, women gave birth to a large number of children. Birth rates were high. They were perhaps 30 per thousand population, but so were death rates. And what happens in the 19th century is the death rates start declining and the birth rates even go up a little bit. And that's where you get the population boom that Paul Ayer thought was catastrophic. What he didn't realize when he wrote The Population Boom, that there was a second phase to this that is sometimes called the demographic transition, where high birth rates and low death rates that lead to a population boom, they are stabilized as birth rates drop in line with death rates. So today, instead of having 30, 35 per thousand population giving birth in a year, now it's about 10. It's the same with the death rate. So everything has dropped by 2/3 really. And now we are facing with a problem that comes out of that, maybe getting even more out of balance, but it is not a trend that can be, nor should it be reversed, I think. The reason why people stopped having so many babies in the 19th century is partly a greater sense of choice, but also a greater sense that large numbers of children were no longer needed and were very costly. And so beginning with the rich and then gradually trickling down to the poor, people reduced their birth rates. And this problem of the low birth rate is actually kind of a pretty long term. In 1940, there was a birth rate in America that was less than 2. In 1976, it was also less than 2. So what we're facing now is important, but I think we need to keep a perspective on it.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I'm going to save my questions for a next round, but there are plenty of questions I have for both of you. I would like to weigh in here. I brought a painting today to our show, which those on YouTube will be able to see, which is very personal to me and I think represents a core of what I would like to bring, which is in lived experience. I will say that the research that I'm going to focus on is the tenuous attachments of men, which I think is very focused on working class. A lot of the research doesn't address class issues, but it really gets at the struggle, which I think is just, we're not going to get at this issue without talking about. The painting that's behind me came out of a dream. I have my own sense of understanding of dreams. In the dream self, I don't feel that there is a clear distinction between masculine and feminine, that within us, the capacity to understand whatever you might assign to those along the way in that spectrum. But I think in actuality, it is the pairing that comes together, whether that comes through partnerships or through our life experiences, is an individual journey. In this particular dream, though, it was about Armageddon. There was an Armageddon, and I was with my partner, or I don't know who the male figure was. It was nobody particular. We were in an underground bunker. And he said to me, I have to go out and fight. This is a war. And I said, I'm pregnant. And he said, stay here. Don't go. I will come back. And I waited. And the dream, continues. And I decide I have to leave. And now I have a child. So the painting is about me leaving this bunker. And as you can see, it's kind of this desolate landscape. And I'm looking back, leaving this bunker, wondering if he comes back, I'm not going to be there. But I have to go out into the world. It's been 3 years, and I don't know what that 3 years means. And I've done a number of paintings about this, but I think it was some reflection of what was going on in my life. But I think there is some truth that is universally played out. I don't think in this dream I intended to have a child. I think I had a child. And I think that's what life is. Life happened. And there's a lot in the tenuous attachments that relays this almost, where do you find the balance between waiting and making sure everything's right? And where do you just live your life? And I think that there is a whole lot of research that can substantiate why we do or don't make decisions. But I really want to defend that there is a desire for children. There is in both men and women a desire to have children. But for whatever reason, whether it's rational thinking or other factors, we are not having them. So that's my answer.
I couldn't agree with you more. And I think the question still remains, why are they not?
Yes.
But I agree with you. I think it's kind of innate in most men and women, maybe close to all, to have children. And so at some degree, I think there's that innate desire. And so the question is, why not now?
Yeah. And I want to do in this next round something more of a deep dive. And I will say from my part, I tried to search for qualitative data. So the tenuous attachments is a qualitative data study as opposed to the Pew Research, which frustrated me because I wanted to know exactly, if you didn't have a conversation with somebody and they just said, no, I just don't want to have kids, you're not learning that much, in my opinion. So let's go back around it. Gary, you have great understanding of some of the historical perspectives here, and I hope you can help us make sense of some of the research. Give us a deeper dive, what you learned from writing your book that gives you some insight as to where we are at today.
I think it's important to recognize that the period of our baby boomer, I'm a baby boomer in the senior class, that was a generation which reversed earlier trends toward reduced childbearing. It changed dramatically. By 1960, the average woman bore 3.7 children as opposed to 2 in 1940. So there's a big shift. But what happens thereafter, and particularly after 1970, is the significant drop that has resulted in what Matt has pointed out as the 1.6 or even a little bit lower for women. A lot of that has to do with the trend that I was interested in when I wrote a book called Men to Boys, and that is the matter of delayed marriage. And this is an interesting trend because in the real traditional times, say the 17th, 18th century, people got married, men at 28, women at 27, according to one study, and it dropped all the way down to 21 for men and 20 for women by 1955. That's a really big change. And what happened was that people by the mid 1950s were moving from childhood into raising children almost immediately. They had no time apart in a separate life of singlehood. And that changes dramatically, particularly in the 70s. The age of first marriage in 1970 for men was almost 22. For women, it was 20. Today, it's for men, 30, 28 for women. That's enormous in demographic terms. So what that means is that young people have a really long period of time in singlehood. There's never been a time in our history where more people have been outside of families and outside of marriage. The reason for that is very complicated. Some of it is cultural, some of it is desire on the part of young people to avoid things like being providers or being mothers. They want to extend to some extent their childhood or that era of freedom in their lives. And for many of them, there is maybe a little reluctance to leave. You see this across a lot of things. Adult men playing video games when formerly, when men got older, they give up children's games and so forth and so on. So what you have is a new culture that is in part avoided, kind of maybe not altogether rejected, but is more ambiguous about the role of being a provider. It doesn't come naturally anymore. Similarly for women as being mothers. If you were to look at it historically, you might find our assumption that people have always wanted to have children is perhaps you need to take that with a grain of salt. People didn't treat their children very well in the 17th and 18th century. It's really only as the rate of childbearing decreases as people cut back on having children in the beginning of the 20th century that you began to see this focus on the young child as cute, as adorable, as a person with whom you want to have a relationship and draw out your feelings. This is really part of this shift towards smaller families and a way that society tries to counteract this tendency to avoid having children.
Yeah. Gary, let's just poke at this a little bit. I do think there was a study I came across that talked about when women had fewer opportunities in the workplace, they would decide, oh, this isn't worth it. So their future really rested on finding a husband. Because they weren't going to get paid in the workplace, they weren't going to get to do what they wanted to do in the workplace. And so marriage became more of a viable path for a future. So I saw some studies around that. But when I think about our messy history, I think about men as I've always been like to play. I would like to push back on that. And I think about the Europeans and the European culture. And I'm going to be, blasé about this, and I apologize. This is not based on research. This is more anecdotal. But in European culture, it was for a long time understood. Women are like, I'm not having any more kids. It's okay if you go outside the marriage because there was no birth control. All I know is that in Europe, it was much more settled that when people are married, they're married. They don't divorce. And that sometimes there were these relationships outside the marriage and women didn't have the same opportunities. Again, I'm being very broad and it's not true for a lot of hardworking women that were nurses and teachers and so on and so forth. But I do wonder whether the men not wanting to mature, okay, if we were to take the examples of history where boys are in the workplace by the time they're 14, is that a way to contrast it? Like, are you saying that in earlier generations, they didn't have an option? They were out of the house by the time they were 18. Out of high school, they had to find a job or go to school. Is it that we no longer had a society where that was necessary, that there was an option to stay at home? I'm not sure. I'm just curious. Like when you define men acting as boys.
I'm speaking about the fairly near past. probably mostly from the 1970s. You see signs of this change. So you think of Hugh Hefner or the Beats and On the Road and this kind of general avoidance of providership. There was a rebellion against a Victorian culture that defined male maturity as being providers, being the outside worker that provided for the family while the mother nurtured and cared for the children. These divisions become much sharper in the 19th century than they had been further in the past. And there is a kind of rebellion against that. You see it in Betty Friedan's book of 1963, The Federal Mystique, where women who played the role, she was about my mother's age, 4 children in the 1940s, and feeling by the time she was in her middle age that maybe she had missed out on her own freedom by having children too early and too consciously. While men have strayed, the playfulness I'm talking about is deeper because men who did that still generally stayed in the family relationship. The real problem is cultural. I mean, this argument I make in my book, this decline of this economic role that men had as providers for family and children wasn't replaced by a different definition of maturity, which I would like to think of as the male as a nurturer and a relationship builder and a co-partner in the home with the woman. That seems to me is in certain ways at the heart of at least one of the reasons why women may not want to have so many children, because there is some indication that they realize they won't get the kind of support they need from the father.
Yeah. So that's addressed in the tenuous attachment study as well, which I will put into the show notes. But this idea of the provider and that the young man, the identity shift hasn't happened. So they're still thinking, I can't get married. I want children. I can't get married because I'm not yet financially stable. And if I'm not the provider, what am I?
It's not just cultural, it's definitely economic.
Matt, I don't know if you want to carry any of that forward or whether you want to take it at a different angle with some of the research you are paying attention to.
Well, you guys talked about a ton of things right there.
Sorry.
There's a few things that I would, but one of the things I want to mention is that Gary had said that there has been this steady decline for, the last 200 or 300 years. But then he points out, and then he has a big, huge area about how it had increased. And I guess the argument I would make is that we've agreed that these birth rates can change. He suggested that it was kind of this continual decline, but then he had to give the example that for like half a century, it didn't. That's like 1/4 of the time period he's talking about. One of the things we really ought to explore are these social cues that come. So in the 1950s, what were the social cues for men and women versus what are the social cues for men and women today? I think that is at least part of the story. What are men expected to do? What are women expected to do? I'm not suggesting any of these are right or wrong. I'm just describing, I think, what has happened. Those social and stigmas. If you don't do certain things, like if you had a guy, I still remember this as a little kid, there would be a guy in his 30s and if he wasn't married, you'd look at him like there was a problem. You say, what's his problem? That would be the question. You wouldn't necessarily say that about women. Remember the old term, the spinster. We had all these kinds of terms because there were social cues, expectations, and stigmas. A lot of those have changed. Maybe many of them for the better, maybe some of them for the worse. I think there is an impact economically, but over the last 30 years, there have been nations employing all sorts of economic incentives for women and men to have kids, and it isn't working. I'm not suggesting economics do not have any role in it. I just don't think it's the core. If it was, these economic incentives would change it, and they're not.
Do you want me to respond?
Yes, go ahead. I want to follow up on that as well. Go ahead, Gary.
I agree that there have been these significant cultural changes, and that in part explains this shift of marriage from the early 20s to the late 20s or even older. The shift is about young people not wanting to rush into a pattern they saw in their parents of men being expected to be a provider, women expecting to have children, and instead developing their own identity prior to that. To some extent, people on the right generally say this is an indication of selfishness. I certainly see that point. One of the major correlations between reduced birth rates is the astonishing rise in cost for raising children. This is due in part because women have entered the workforce in large numbers. In 1950, 25% of American women were employed outside the home. Now it's 61%. If you have children under the age of 6, in 1950, it was 12% of married women were employed. Today, it's 66%. And so what happens is the cost of things like daycare, and other costs have really made it difficult to have children. It's not just the cost, it's the time, because if all these former stay-at-home moms are now working, and I'm not opposed to that, what that means is the households are actually contributing a lot more to the market than they did 40 or 50 years ago. And that practical terms means a huge amount of overwork on the part of young couples with children that makes it extremely difficult to choose to have children today. And one way to alleviate that is a series of governmental actions like support for children, support for parental leave, insisting on paid leave, which is almost universal in the developed rest of the world, but also maybe help subsidizing daycare. There's a lot of support we give to old people, but very little support for families. While these things haven't stopped decrease, these things are present in places like Sweden. It hasn't stopped the decrease in the birth rate. Without them, the birth rates, I'm certain, would be even lower. And in any case, it's just the civilized thing to do to support families in those very critical periods of their lives.
Yeah. I think our listeners would find us remiss if we did not address some of the economic pressures. And you touched on that as well, Gary. And I do want to dip a toe in on Gary's side of the line there, because I do think, for instance, that we've gotten used to a level of life. I have seen this. I'm a frugal person. I inherited this practice from my family, and I see what I can live on versus what other families, feel they need to have. And I am not critical at all. I simply am reflecting on the changed expectations that people feel, that they are not like making it unless they are making this much money, putting this much away. And I don't know how to reverse or change that. This is just what it is. Again, this is life. But I think that the economic requirements, the research is just, I got a stack of it here. The cost of healthcare, the cost of housing, the cost of education. Did I say childcare already? I mean, it is an amazing array of costs that have to be managed now for raising a family. But I would say, if I were to challenge those who feel that makes sense, why wouldn't people delay children or not have them at all, given the circumstances? I would challenge them to rethink how they're living and how we are living, and that we have agency in how we construct our lives. I don't think that's been challenged enough. And I think we are talking about cultural and economic drivers. And it's very easy to point to why women have more control over the ability to whether they have children or not. It's easy to point to the economic factors that would make a good case for why you shouldn't have children. But I think that we need to think more clearly about where we're going with this. If we work with the assumption that this is all true, what next? Where are we going to land? I hope that this can also lead into our segment that we wanted to address some of the reasons why this is a hard conversation. So if we were to assume, yes, it's economically difficult to raise a child right now. It's extremely expensive. And we read in the research how young people say, well, I don't know why I would bring a child into this world. What is being done about climate and about, all the deterioration of our democracy, or whatever it is that they're fearing right now. So if all of that is true, what is it that is what is the driver to take us to a different future? And why is some of these things hard to talk about? What are the uncomfortable conversations that we're not having?
Can I, Nancy, before we move on to this next one, I want to make one last comment about the economics, because I think there's some assumptions that I think are just not correct. And I'll just give you one assumption. So you see in the data that it costs on average like $250,000 to raise a kid, anywhere between $200,000 and $300,000. I have 7 kids. My wife and I have 7 kids. I grew up in a family of 10 kids. We have 10 grandkids. It does not cost 200 and some odd $1,000 to raise a kid. I don't even think I would have made that amount of money over that time period if it cost $250,000 to raise a kid. So I think we're inflating these numbers and then using those inflated numbers to explain. If you say your kid is going to be in daycare his or her whole life, you're not going to get your health care subsidized by your employer at all, and he's going to go to the most expensive university there is. I could see how you could maybe get up to $200,000 or $300,000. But absent that, it just doesn't cost that much. I'm not suggesting it doesn't cost a lot of money. It does cost a lot of money to raise a kid. But the data, I got real problems with the data because it just doesn't jive with what I see in real life. And so I just want to make that point because we use that data as a foundation to say, look, it's just way too expensive. And I would challenge that data.
Well, maybe you're just frugal.
Well, I've got 64 nieces and nephews. I see this all over the place. I've seen families, it just doesn't cost that much. Because if it did, none of my siblings and a lot of my friends who have kids would ever be able to afford it, knowing what they make.
Historically, the people that lowered their birth rates the earliest were the richest people. If you go back to the 18th century, the largest households were households of the rich. The smallest were of the poor. And when the population boom came, it just reversed itself. And the reason was because rich people found that having 6 or 7 children got in the way of passing on their class status, their middle class status, upper class status to their children because it costs a lot more to raise rich kids than it does poor kids historically. So there's that pattern. And I wouldn't quibble with the number. 250,000 seems like a lot. Then you have to take into account the third car that you need. I think a lot of it is that when I was a little kid, we lived in a crackerbox house, 2 tiny bedrooms, 6 of us, all 4 of the kids lived in one bedroom. Well, nobody does that anymore. The average home size in 1950, I was fascinated by this, was about 900 square feet. Now it's like 2,600 square feet. The standards of raising children have gone up enormously. I tend to think, watching my own granddaughter, maybe they don't need quite so much stuff. And I'll agree with you about that.
I think the listeners would really like to know, particularly your younger generation, what about you in your situation? Can you talk about your children or even some of the youngest in your extended family? What are some things that they are doing and how they make it work?
Well, I think first of all, 4 is a big family today. None of our kids have any more than 4 kids. So the size has come down. I think that's a lot of social cues and expectations. But in our personal experience, we got married in 1990 and this trend had already happened. That trend is the status of motherhood in society. How do people look at mothers? I think that has changed dramatically. And I think some women feel, now my wife ran business. She had all sorts of creative things going on in our house. She was running all these different things. But she was always home because that was what she wanted to do. When we were dating, she made it very clear she wanted to have a lot of kids and be home with those kids, even though she wanted to dabble in other things. And she did that. I can't tell you the number of times there were comments made that were derogatory when she told people what she did. Many came from women. It was almost, I remember hearing someone say she wasted her education because she didn't go out and have a career. I think I knew what they meant. They probably didn't mean to be mean, but think about all the signals that sends. So if you're a woman and you're a college-educated woman, all the cues are, if I have a kid and I stay home with that kid, it's kind of the double whammy, then somehow I'm less than. One of the contributors is the lowering of the status of the position of mother.
Truly, I remember the 90s that way, and my friends who were mothers echoed that. I'd like to go back, Matt. So today, would you say that your offspring are choosing to live in smaller home units? Is one staying home? I'm just curious if the structure of the living supports a less expensive version of raising a family. I'm not sure what that is. I think people really want to know what that is.
No, I think to Gary's point, there is a certain level of frugality that if you look at people's lifestyles and what they do and what they live in and what they drive, there are a number of decisions. We have 3 children who are married now. 2 of them have 4 kids and 1 of them has 2 kids. The 2 that have 4 kids are done. That's all they're having. Both cases, the husband is the primary wage earner, although The wives do dabble and do some things here and there, especially when the kids go to school. So when that youngest one hits kindergarten or first grade, then things change significantly. I think they're very different than probably a lot of their age cohort. But I hear increasingly that there are a lot of men and women, and it'll be interesting to see the fallout of things like the Charlie Kirk assassination. Whether those have any sort of, because he went around and he was like very open, telling, these young men and young women, go get married, have kids. That's where your greatest happiness is going to come from, especially as you get older. Do it. And he was a big proponent for that. So I don't know if things change as a result of that, but I think my kids are probably, I should say our kids, are probably not the norm. I would think most of the people their age are not doing what they're doing.
What are the reasons, perhaps, that while your children are able to kind of hold on to this older pattern of male provider, woman caregiver, is because of the salary of the boys? And that, of course, as everyone knows, men's salaries, particularly in the working class, have been stagnant for decades. That's why we've gone from 25% of married women in the workforce to 61% women who would like to stay at home. I know one right now who has a very demanding job and would like to work less because she has a 1-year-old daughter, but can't because of the demands of her career and the demands of the household income.
I think one of the difficult conversations has to do with divorce. When we were coming up, divorce was very rare. I think there was a generation after us that said, oh man, I am not going to go through that. I think there has been some impact. I think the research bears out, and I should solidify this with a citation, but those who have been through divorce are just a little bit more tenuous about their attachments to people. I think that is part of that working class finding. I don't want my kids to go through what I went through. So we're just not going to marry to start out with. We're just going to do this differently. Divorce is understood differently today. But I think along the line, there is something there that some want to say, divorce is okay and it is not harmful. Therefore, we have to accept life as it is. There's others who will say, no, I think divorce has had an impact on whether people feel comfortable about their attachments as they mature. I think that's a difficult conversation for people to talk about.
Divorce is difficult. A whole lot of other issues come up over the culture versus the economic causes of small families. Generally, conservatives tend to discount the economic sides. Liberals tend to discount the cultural argument that we become too selfish, too individualistic. In America, particularly where there is a very strong anti-state perspective compared to Europe, even providing any real improvement in the conditions of young families, like giving subsidies for child care or paid family leave, something that was brought up again in 2020, but quickly shut down and certainly is not in the offing right now. That gets in the way of any discussion of the total picture. On the side of the left, there is a similar concern that when people talk glowingly about the importance of being mothers or being providers, that this is an attempt to restore patriarchy or to deny the inevitable freedom that we have, freedom of choice, freedom to choose to live an independent life. You remember the blowback from when Vance talked about cat women a year ago, all those women who said, yeah, maybe I have a cat, but so what?
My takeaway today is that we don't have the research that really gets at the answers to this. I think we're exploring it. But if you look at research by generation, my generation, there's a lot that happened that I could say about why I don't have children and have cats. I will tell you, my youngest brother was a latchkey kid. My parents did not divorce, but my mom went back. And what was I doing? I was raising 3 brothers. I had a real strong impression in my mind. Number one is that education is valued. My mom went back for her studies in literature, and I decided I'm going to extend my years of education before I get married. Also, our generation, we were still in the throes of what happened when you got divorced. You got the house, period. So divorce laws changed. So as you go down the generations, people have different perceptions about divorce. But if you're talking about the boomers, we had a lot of moral confusion. No wonder that some of us came out the other side with fewer kids or no kids. The tenuous attachments research, which I really kind of hang my hat on, is about identity. And if I can't guarantee a stable, lifelong marriage, I can guarantee an identity as a father. I can be that. And women can say, rather than have this possibility of not being lifelong mate, I'm going to be the mother. I'm going to work, and the father's going to help me, give me money to raise a kid, but I don't have to have this long-term attachment to someone. These are from cities in the U.S. I'll put it in the show notes, but it was different urban settings that they took these narratives. So that might weigh somewhat into the result.
Let me think about the marriage thing, because I really think that's another one of those core issues is marriage. And you were alluding to something really important that we really don't talk enough about. I don't know if there's been any research done on this, but you have a marriage and there's 3 parties to a marriage. Okay. Mm-hmm. Well, there's definitely 2 and sometimes 3. So that men get something out of a marriage that statistically on average is probably similar to other men. And then women on average statistically get something else out of marriage. And then kids get something out of marriage. I would refer everyone to Brad Wilcox, the professor at University of Virginia. There's a program at University of Virginia called the Marriage Project, and he does a ton of research on this. Society historically emphasized that there were those 3 interests involved in a marriage. And so the motivations would be, the kid created a motivation. It's the swipe left, swipe right thing. Women have become more economically independent. But as a result, women tend to marry up. So when they're looking at their dating app, numbers show this, they swipe left almost 90% of the time. They only swipe right like 14%. So 85% of the time they pass on a particular candidate. Whereas men choose 60% of the time and they only pass 40%. I think from the perspective of women, their pool of eligible men has reduced significantly. I do think a lot of men aren't really growing up, at least in the way we traditionally define growing up. So I think that whole marriage thing, and I think a lot of typically having kids in our society typically happens within a marriage, but by no means is that, it's in some cultures, it's not even a majority, but I think men and women feel more comfortable having kids in a marriage relationship. So as marriage goes down, I think it would follow that your birth rate goes down as well.
Yeah, I think that the statistics show that. Gary, I would like you to maybe offer this in our last segment before we close, what might be an approach, either a policy response or an approach that we might take to make this more of an option as a choice, as a viable choice to have children.
Well, first, from what I said at the beginning, the trend to have smaller families is not reversible. Certainly not the kind of numbers that we had in the 1950s. The 50s were atypical because it came out of the war, out of the Depression, and there was a huge amount of pressure to have large families. Even my mother had 4 children. She was an artist and wasn't particularly motherly, a wonderful lady. What strikes me is we need to think about how we might make the idea of having children more positive. That doesn't mean going back to a kind of patriarchal father knows best situation, which a lot of people would resist because we have a culture of freedom that contradicts them. But there are ways of making that option more appealing. Some of them are economic, such as is creating environments where some of the costs, particularly of early child bearing and rearing, are taken into account and treated seriously. But also, I think there needs to be some way of encouraging men to think about maturity as a time of nurturing instead of simply being a provider. And women being able to be mothers, but also contribute to the wider society if they so choose. And that's a complicated idea. It's more difficult than saying women should stay at home, men should go out and earn money. But that model hasn't worked in the long run for a lot of people for lots of reasons. Improving the cultural side of it would be, things like in schools. I was talking to a 12-year-old the other day down the street, and I said, do you ever take home ec classes where you're given any training in child rearing? And he said, no, I don't know that that's done very much. But things like that to encourage men to think of having children in a more positive way. I have to admit, before I had my children, I never gave a moment's thought to having children. It's just something that came after the event. It strikes me as those sorts of things, maybe other kinds of cultural pushes that are not blaming people for not having children, but encouraging people to see some of the possibilities of having lifelong relationships with another generation.
I love that idea, and I will share my idea for a policy response and an approach starts with very practical, but can get more idealistic. At the practical end, I think we can look at our zoning and planning uses of space and allow for homes to have, for instance, another dwelling that would allow for another generation to be on site. And there's a lot of municipalities that have explored this option. And I think that allows for parents who can help with caretaking. And, you can have, younger generations living in that dwelling. You can have older generations living in that dwelling. But I think zoning really does have, from a practical standpoint, some ways that can elevate. I think local communities can do a better job with having centers. We talk about deserts in Pennsylvania where there's just no health care. In my idealism, I see a design where it's more community-based. You have dwellings that include, within a small community, include childcare just for that small community, include like a nursing office. It doesn't have to be a full medical facility, just a place that could be triage. We have so much telecare now that a place within that community can help if there's an outbreak of some sort. From my idealistic viewpoint, we need to start rethinking how we build and design communities. Gary, I agree with you 100%. It's got to be intergenerational and supportive of a family. If there can really be a belief of security and support, I think young people will find that appealing. We have some work to do to get there. But to start, I think zoning, generational housing options are where communities can begin. Matt, we're talking about some policy approaches. Do you have any thoughts about things that might happen at a local level?
I'm fully supportive of a lot of those economic incentives that a lot of people talk about. I don't think they solve the problem, but I think they help. They can't hurt. You can debate about what the best policies are, but I think generally speaking, a lot of the things you mentioned are good ideas that definitely should be explored. The declining birth rate, we haven't even talked about a lot of the other contributors. There's even biological ones. I think there's a lot of things going on. My personal opinion is it appears to be cultural. If you had to pick one category, I think cultural is one of them. I happen to think that we've got to be a little more honest with people about their fertility. Yeah, I have a number of friends who waited to have their kids when they were in their late 30s and then couldn't have kids. Fertility is not this perfectly linear thing. For men, it kind of is generally, but for women, it can fluctuate. Data points such as if you wait to have your first kid at 30, the chance biologically of conceiving drops by some percentage. If you have your first kid in your early 20s, it's greater likely that you can have kids in your 30s. I think women need to be more educated about what they can expect in their fertility. I think there's a lot of women who want to have kids, but maybe kind of don't understand how all that works. And then they reach a point, it's like, oh, crud, now I can't. Of course, the marriage stuff. The other thing is, I think we've got to do a better job of, like Arthur Brooks talks a lot about this stuff, about happiness. And he's got his little formula for happiness. And I tend to agree with a lot of what he says, but we haven't even talked about what's happened to women's happiness. If you look at women, and they've been doing these women's happiness polls for decades now, and it's like a straight linear line down. And I don't claim to understand all the reasons why, but I think we ought to probably maybe try and explore that a little more about, why are women less happy now when they're so much better off in so many other categories? They have so many other options that their parents and grandparents never even could have conceived of. Why are they a lot less happy? And then lastly, there's an example that someone I had heard. When the fire department gets called to come out and get a cat out of the tree, you could probably conclude that cat wasn't raised with other cats, that was just a house cat. and never saw how you get out of a tree. I think what Gary mentioned earlier is you typically learn behaviors by watching other people engage in those behaviors. And typically it's your parents or older people, and so I think we need to do a better job of modeling behavior. I'm not just talking about birth rates. You talked about male maturity. Well, we probably need to do a better job of modeling good behavior for young men so they don't end up being like adolescents at 30 years old, which is a big problem. Those are a couple of thoughts, but I think the economic stuff, I'm not saying the economic stuff is not important. I think, of course, it's important. I just don't think you do searches online, especially with AI, they list nothing but economic stuff. And I just don't think that's accurate.
Yeah. I will add as a footnote, because I was just reading this morning, on fertility, although men remain able to have children longer than women, there is a lot of evidence now that greater risks are associated with older men having children. And I think that's also something that both men and women need to be aware of.
Absolutely.
There's a lot of reasons why we should start young. My friends did have children late. Whew. It's tough when you're just hoping you can make it until they have kids.
We are so individualistic and live in our own age cohort. This has a lot to do with consumption. There are real virtues, and you mentioned the zoning of having people not only have a closer relationship with the young, but also with the old, and to recognize that there is a dimension to life that's valuable in relating to, knowing, experiencing, learning from people of other generations.
Yeah. Just letting life happen. That was something that has come out of this thought process for me. It's important not to overplan and to accept the serendipity aspects of life. You got to trust that your life has a lot of gold in it that you're not going to be able to plan for. And you have to let it happen. And so working on trust, I guess, in yourself. Thank you so much for having this conversation. I am going to do my due diligence to help the viewer listener if they do want to dive into this. It is a really, excuse the pun, fertile area for discovery. There is a lot out there. I don't think anyone has found any, there's no shot here to the moon. We're still trying to figure out how to create a different future. So I thank you for coming to the conversation.
Thank you, Gary, and thank you, Nancy. I enjoyed it.
I've learned a lot from you both. Thank you. See you.
All right.
We'll be in touch.